great to be here, to see a lot of old friends who I've worked with across the years. As Jim mentioned, my company, TAG Consulting, works with a lot of different kinds of organizations, not just churches. Those of you who are here who are my clients have probably heard this story before, but one of our very first clients at TAG was the Department of the Army, the U.S. Army. We've been around for 15 years now, but when we first started the company back in 1998, we had no clients, we had no money, no capital. We started the company with our own personal lines of credit, and back then that meant I had about $10 to contribute, so I contributed a lot of sweat equity. But our first client, our first big client, was the U.S. Army. It was a fascinating process. They were in the midst of what they were calling the Army Transformation. The Army Transformation was when the Army was trying to move from the Cold War era of being prepared to fight two wars simultaneously on two different continents to moving into this new era that we were living in with terrorism and guerrilla warfare and so forth. So they had commissioned, Jack Keane was the vice chief of staff at the time, he had commissioned another consulting firm to study the U.S. Army, to figure out what needed to change in the Army to make this paradigm shift. We estimated they probably paid about $13 or $14 million for this study. They called me. We had no clients. Had no idea why they called us. But they called me and they said, we need a group to help the top brass work through these recommendations and reach consensus. I haven't received any calls from Congress recently, so it may tell you how good a job we did. But they called us to work with the 40 top brass of the U.S. Army over the course of several months and culminating in a week-long meeting in Arlington, Virginia. So we got to that meeting, and they gave us the recommendations from this other consulting firm, 700 pages of recommendations of what needs to change in the Army. 40 top brass in that room. Jack Keane was the only one who was not there. He was the one who had commissioned the study. So we started working through these recommendations. I put the first PowerPoint up on the screen, and it wasn't this one. But within 3 seconds, one of the generals who was at the back of the room picked up his book full of recommendations, threw it on the table, and said, "This is a word that I can't say in front of pastors," or at least some pastors. Something like hogwash. This is hogwash. This isn't transformation. We need transformation. He said, this is like shifting deck chairs in the Titanic. And he started reading through the recommendations one by one, change the software program and for this department, move this department from this part of the Pentagon to another part, move these group of people down to Crystal City. He started reading through all these recommendations. He said, this isn't real change. We need real change. Pretty soon, all the other generals were standing up and throwing their books down and yelling at each other. And I thought, holy cow, I'm supposed to be a professional facilitator, and I've completely lost control of this group. Well, then all of a sudden, my partner, Joe Drakowski, raised his hand, and he asked that group one question. And when he asked that question, they shut up and they sat down. What question do you think he asked them? Some people might say, well, what do you want to do? Where are you heading? What's the direction? What are we trying to accomplish? What he asked them is, which one of you is going to tell Jack Keane that he just wasted $13 million? They sat down and they shut up. It was a fascinating process. And by the way, the guy that started the whole chaos, his name was John Pickler, a wonderful man. He was the head of operations for the Army. And he told me, he said, let me tell you something, young man. This was 15 years ago. I was still a young man. He said, I was shot down in Vietnam 3 times in the same day. I said, why'd you keep going back up? He said, because they ticked me off. Well, all of a sudden I realized I had just ticked him off. But it was a fascinating process. Over the next several days, we learned that there were a couple of issues going on. One, the generals needed to know what they called the commander's intent Where are we heading? What are we trying to accomplish? That was a real issue that they needed to know before they could go through 700 pages of recommendations and say yes, no, or maybe to them. But the other deeper issue that was fascinating to me and was a real leadership lesson as the Army was trying to transform itself, when those generals sat down and shut up, what were they scared of? They weren't scared of change. They were scared of losing their jobs. They were scared of being shipped off to Guam for the rest of their career. They knew that if they challenged their commanding officer, their CO, that would be the end of their career. So they had a choice to make. Do I actually challenge the CO, the commanding officer, or do I let things remain as they are? Well, over the course of that process, I won't tell you all the results, but Ray Odierno was actually the one who caught Saddam Hussein, who led that process for us and went back to Jack Keane and pushed back and said, you just wasted $13 million. And so the Army went through a process of transformation. But that illustrated three things for me. And I wrote about this some in my book, The Leadership Triangle. 3 types of problems embedded in one situation. The first type of problem was tactical. There were 700 tactical issues that needed to be addressed, but those issues could not be addressed outside of having a context of strategic. What are we trying to accomplish? So the second type of challenge that any organization, including churches, faces is not just tactical, but strategic. But what was blocking progress on both of those issues was a deeper issue, what I call transformational, competing values. Am I willing to risk losing my job or ending my career to do what I think is best for the Army? Competing values. There's a risk element involved in that. So we've got transformational issues, strategic issues, and tactical issues. When we are not aligned, that's when we have problems. Now, the church work that we do, the consulting that we do with most churches, what I find is that most of the time, the well-intentioned leaders that we work with try to focus on which of those 3 issues, transformational, strategic, or tactical. Most of it is tactical. You look at your session meetings, go back and read your minutes over the last number of years, you're going to see a lot of tactical stuff in there. What most churches are not doing a good job at is the strategic piece, which is where are we heading? Who are we? What are we trying to accomplish? And then dealing with the resistance and the pushback that comes along the way, which is the transformational side of that triangle. So let me tell you a little bit about what I'm learning, and what I say here is what I'm learning based on what you've taught me, because many of you in this room have been clients of TAG over the last number of years. One of our clients is actually a Lutheran church in Renton, Washington. It's a small church, a church of about 300 or 400 people. And Pastor Kirby Untie, Stuart, you know Kirby, don't you? Kirby is a wonderful man, but we started working with them about 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 9 years ago. And this was a church that was terribly misaligned. The staff really did not like each other. They didn't want to be in the same room together. They were constantly fighting. We got in and did an assessment. We did our survey that we do with most congregations and a series of focus groups and so forth. What we found out is they had no core identity, what we call core ideology at TAG. They had no sense of who we are. So we went through a very interesting process of helping them discover their core values. We put a group of 25 leaders in a room together and broke them into breakout groups and gave them questions to think back on the history of the church and what had meant the most to them and the decisions the church has made. So we wanted core values to actually come out of who the church really was, what they had experienced historically. They arrived at 5 words. This was not rocket science, but this was incredibly meaningful to them. Welcome. So Pastor Kirby on a Sunday morning walks into church with his cup of coffee. It's right outside of Seattle, so of course they're going to have coffee in the sanctuary. And he's very casual. You're allowed to bring coffee in. Very welcoming atmosphere. Story, the cross, hands that care, humor. These things all mean something to those people. When we finished the process, what we realized, and what some of the staff realized, is I don't fit. This doesn't line up with who I am. And so most of the staff from 7 years ago isn't there today. But as they started their search process around the country, 5, 6, 7 years ago, they began drawing people to the church who said, yes, I resonate with those values. That's who I am. It's been a fascinating process of alignment. And what's happened is this little tiny church who had about 6 or 7 people in their youth group 7 years ago started a ministry out of their core values that was a before-school breakfast, after-school program for the middle school across the street. Remember, they only had about 6 or 7 kids in their youth group 7 years ago. Today, they're averaging about 70 kids before school and 60 after school. They served 500 kids last year. They started a new ministry to the Chinese community in Renton, Washington. This church has become known as the church that ministers to the city of Renton. They started Luther's Table. They took an old church, dead Lutheran church, downtown Renton. They converted it into daytime a cafe, nighttime a pub. They actually sell beer and wine there. They have music at the church, and they take all the proceeds and give it to a different charity every month. So Salvation Army or Catholic Charities or Lutheran Family Services and so forth will receive the benefits from their proceeds, and they're serving about 1,000 people every week now. Church of 300 or 400 people. What an incredible ministry. They realized that they had some space over top of Luther's Table, weren't quite sure what to do with that, so guess what they did? They identified the single greatest unmet need or undermet need in the city of Renton. And they realized it was homeless, disabled vets and their families. So they built a transitional housing center above Luther's Table with 47 apartments that are spectacular. They're beautiful apartments. There's a waiting list. And they've had a lot of people who've moved in. It's just been a wonderful experience. This is a church that was 7 years ago horribly misaligned. Today is making an incredible difference in their community. And it's not, I've worked with down the road here, Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale, 25,000 members. There's those kind of churches out there that we all know about. We all know about the First Pres Colorado Springs and Memorial Drive Presbyterian in Houston and so forth. But this is a church of 300 or 400 people who is making a significant difference in their local community. And one of the reasons why is because they are aligned. And this is where I'm going to spend the majority of my time over the next 30 minutes or so, is talking about alignment. 4 points to this compass: core ideology, infrastructure, culture, and brand. Our core ideology, I'm not going to spend time on all 4 of these. We don't have time for that. I'm going to focus primarily on the ideology, infrastructure, and culture. But our core ideology is a combination of our code, which is our DNA, what makes us unique, and our strategy, which is where we're focusing our resources. A lot of churches do a good job on one piece or the other, but not on both, preserving who we are, but also changing to meet the needs of the world around us. Infrastructure is the who and the how. This is who's leading and how are we organized, how are we structuring, how are we making decisions, how do we close down ministries, how do we launch ministries, how do we train people, all the how, the operational side of ministry. Culture is a combination of our code, our practices and our actions. So our actions are the things that we intentionally do to celebrate, to move people into a new direction, to commission. It's also our regular practices, the things that the church does on a regular basis. Todd Bolsinger, who's going to be speaking this afternoon, later on, I think in the other room, also works for TAG on a part-time basis. And Todd and I worked on this concept together over the last couple of years. Hope you'll go hear him speak. But let's unpack this a little bit. When we talk about alignment, because all 4 of these pieces have to be aligned for us to get where Jim Singleton was talking about this morning, where we get to that new reality and keep the church and keep the institution from really becoming entrenched. So the first task of leadership is to determine what needs to be preserved and what needs to change. I was working several years ago at a small little church in Corpus Christi, Texas, and we had 3 weekends together with the leadership after we had finished our assessment process. And so I sat down with the church leadership, the lay leadership, and the staff leadership, and their big question was, we've got 10 acres, we're not sure what to do with it. So we did the demographic study of the community and focus groups and so forth, and it was obvious that the church could really serve the teenage population in Corpus Christi through building a gymnasium. That was part of the strategic plan. So we went through this process. But there was Marilyn. Marilyn was sitting in the back of the room, and she was about 80 years old. And she sat like this 3 weekends in a row with her arms folded and a scowl on her face. And I could never engage her, could never get her talking. Even at the breaks, I'd go try to find her, and she walked away from me. So finally, with 15 minutes left in the last retreat, and of course I have to fly out of San Antonio that afternoon, I have to drive 2 hours to get to San Antonio, she raises her hand. And she still has that scowl on her face. And she said, "I think we're getting off track here." I thought, "Oh, why couldn't you do this morning when we had time to deal with it?" But she said, "I think we're getting off track here. This is a good church with a great history. We don't need to change anything." And for the next 15 minutes, what do you think the rest of the group did? They tried to convince her that the gymnasium was the right direction. The more they tried to convince her, the more she did what? Yep, the more she dug in her heels. So finally, with about 3 minutes left, and this was driven primarily because I didn't want to spend another night in Corpus Christi, I told the group to be quiet. I turned to Marilyn and I said, "Marilyn, you represent a lot of people in this church, don't you?" She said, "Yes, I do." I said, "What do you think they are most scared of because of this process?" She thought about it for a minute. She said, "We go to the 8 o'clock service. It's the traditional service. We've been going to that same service for the last 30 years. My friends don't want that service to go away." So I turned to the group and I said, "Folks, based on anything that we've talked about this weekend, are we going to change the 8 o'clock service?" They said, "Well, we might have to move it to 8:15. So I said, "Marilyn, do you think your friends could live with 8:15? And she said, "Yeah, I think they could." And we closed in prayer, and I flew home. Now, that was another leadership lesson for me, because what I learned from Marilyn is that we missed her because we didn't start with what needs to be preserved. We started with what needs to change. All she heard is what's going to change. We needed to start with what's not going to change, what needs to be preserved. So the fundamental task of leadership is to distinguish between what needs to be preserved and what needs to change. When we initiate a change process, we should actually start with asking what needs to be preserved. And sometimes, Tom Hall, are you here? There's Tom right there. Tom's a pastor of First Pres Pittsburgh. Sometimes we preserve the wrong things. Can you read that? The service times are literally carved in stone. So poor Tom, he comes into that church 3 years ago and has no choice. But so sometimes we preserve the wrong things. All right, so let's talk about this idea of what we're trying to preserve and aligning ourselves with it. When you see 7-Eleven, when you drive by 7-Eleven, what do you think of? Slurpees. What else? Ice cream. What else? Hot dogs. Okay, convenience, fast, Slurpees, big gulps. What was 7-Eleven's worst training exercise? It's about 10 years ago. They got the brilliant idea of sending all of their managers to the Ritz-Carlton School of Customer Service. Anybody ever been to a Ritz-Carlton? All right. Ritz-Carlton, premium, luxury, customer service like you would not believe. In fact, a guy who works for me, Rich Hurst, some of you may know him. He was at University of President Seattle for a while. Rich did a wedding at the Ritz-Carlton Laguna Niguel, California, several years ago. And he was blown away by this property. In fact, he loved their soaps and their shampoos. So how many of you have ever taken soap or shampoo from the hotel? All right. My drawers at home are lined with the soaps from the Hiltons are really good. I like those. But he filled his suitcase with shampoo and soap from the Ritz-Carlton. The next day he came back to his room and they'd replaced his stash of shampoos and soaps. So he filled up his suitcase with the next round. Third day, he came back to his hotel, and the bed was lined with soaps and shampoos, and a personal note from the manager of the hotel, handwritten, saying, "Dear Mr. Hurst, if you would like more, just let us know." Now that is customer service. So what do you think happened when people went to 7-Eleven to get their Slurpee? And the cashier stopped him and said, "Did you find everything you were looking for? How was your day? How was your drive in? How may I be of service to you?" "What? I just want my Slurpee. Get out of here." 7-Eleven's code is all about convenience and quick, and they missed it when they tried to adopt the Ritz-Carlton method of customer service. What about Sears? When you think of Sears, what do you think of? Appliances. You think of reliability. You think of tools. So you got Craftsman, you got Kenmore, and the Craftsman, if you have a Craftsman hammer that breaks and it's 150 years old, you can take it back and they'll replace it. They will stand by it. So what do you think their worst ad campaign ever was? The softer side of Sears. Because that's not what we think of when we think of Sears. We think of tools, we think of hammers, we think of appliances. We don't think of, can I get some lingerie with my chainsaw? It just doesn't work. All right, so here's another one. Take a look at this picture. What's important to this organization? Just call out some words. Space, spirituality, art. Okay, what kind of organization is this? Museum, hotel lobby, what is it? Retreat Center. This is actually a church. This is Orchard Hill Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Worked with them about 10 years ago. They have a full-time art director at this church, full-time. This is 10% of their narthex. The rest of it is filled with art the same way, and the art all comes from within the congregation. Now, the average American, within 3 seconds, decides whether or not we fit. We drive by a restaurant, we take a look at it, do I fit, yes or no? We drive by a store, do I fit, yes or no? We drive by a hotel, do I fit, yes or no? We drive by a church, if we're looking for a church, do I fit, yes or no? So what kind of person do you think walks into this church and says, "I'm home"? An artist, yeah. Graphic artist, a graphic designer, someone who is maybe more eclectic. You think in terms of worship services at this church, probably eclectic, probably creative, maybe some blending of traditional worship and contemporary worship. Never sure what you're going to get because it's so creative at this church. Now look at this one by contrast. What's this church all about? Utility, yeah, it's functional. So what kind of person drives by this church and says, "I'm home"? An engineer, okay? A bookkeeper, an accountant, someone who values being utilitarian. All right, so, and you get the sense just by looking at the building what this church is all about. So Grand Rapids, Orchard Hill Reformed Church, inside, outside. Yeah, all right. So the engineer driving in the Honda Odyssey with his family and 2 kids in tow drives by and says, "Honey, we're home." And then they walk in. And that graphic designer never even notices this church when they drive by. This is the importance of understanding what our code really is. So our code, and when we work with churches, this is a fairly simple process, but I want to emphasize the word process. This is not a senior pastor or a small group of people sitting down in a room and having a half-day meeting and saying, "What's our code?" It comes through a process of discovery, and the discovery looks at the myths, the larger-than-life stories that we have as a church, the visuals, the things like the narthex and the building and so forth. That begins to tell us what the code of the church is, our traditions, decisions the church has made, our past heroes. Those are all part of the code. One of the things, I was at Memorial Drive in Houston last weekend for their session retreat as Dave Peterson's announced his retirement. And one of the things, when we first started working with them last year, that I heard from virtually every person in the focus groups we did was, this is a church that is a house of prayer and we practice radical generosity. I heard that from newcomers, people who've been there for 2 months or less. I heard it from staff. I heard it from elders. I heard it from long-term members. And I said, what does that look like? And they said, well, house of prayer means that we pray for every member every day. Church of about 5,000. They're praying for every member every day. I said, what about radical generosity? And they said, we practice dollar for dollar giving. Half our budget goes to missions every year. You know, it's a well over $10 million budget at that church. They have a clear sense of their code. And so as a church, it's one of these churches that I walk in and I say, they are aligned. They have a clear sense of who they are. And they've built their structure and everything and their brand and so forth around it. They've truly discovered their code. When we work with churches, oftentimes we find they haven't yet discovered their code, but it's there. And it will be discovered. And then what happens is once we know what our code is, that begins to express itself in our values, our mission, our strategy and vision, and so forth. I'll give you a quick example here. Actually, I won't give you a quick example here. We'll skip to the next concept because I'm running out of time. So let's talk about this next part. So code is the first part of core ideology. Strategy is the second part of core ideology. Forget that first bullet. That's a bunch of business gobbledygook when I do this with corporations. That last bullet is absolutely critical, though, especially given what Jim was talking about this morning. Anyone can operate effectively and still go out of business. We can have good worship services, good children's ministries. We can follow the book of order. We can have good, well-run session meetings that end on time and so forth and still go out of business. In fact, probably many in this room are coming from churches who are in some stage of decline. We can operate effectively and still go out of business if we don't have a clear strategy. Give you an example of one strategy. Strategy is really all about using our resources to meet needs in our local community in a unique way. So one of our clients in Virginia is McLean Bible Church in Vienna, Virginia. About 15, 16, 17 years ago, the pastor there, Lon Solomon, had a daughter who was born with a mental and physical handicap. Her name was Jill. And so Lon, at that time, this is a church of about 800 or 900 people. Lon looked around and said, where do we find ministry for someone like Jill in Northern Virginia? At the same time, he looked around Northern Virginia and said, who's ministering to the young 20-somethings? So as a church leadership, they got together and said, what's our strategy? They realized their strategy was going to be twofold, focusing on the secular kids, 20-somethings, in Northern Virginia, so they could really impact greater Washington, D.C. for the sake of the kingdom, and to meet the needs of people with mental and physical disabilities. So they started this ministry, Access Ministry, with 4 children in one room, church of about 900 people. Over the next years, this is a picture of Jill. Over the next years, that ministry has grown. They're serving about 500 families annually, 75 kids, families of children and beautiful blessings. They've got a summer camp and friendship club, performing arts ministry and so forth. So this little tiny ministry to 4 people. Now, is this about worship? Is it about evangelism? Is it about discipleship? Yes, but it's created around a focus, which is a unique strategy. It's saying we're going to take the things that most churches do and do it in a unique way, targeting people with disabilities. And today, my friend Cameron Doolittle runs Jill's House. And Jill's House is a respite resort for children with mental or physical handicaps. In Northern Virginia, if you have a kid with a severe disability, it costs $2,800 to provide child care so you can take your wife out to dinner and a movie for one overnight, $2,800. So they've built Jill's House where they can host any number of kids there overnight. It's a wonderful experience for them, and it gives the parents a break. What an incredible ministry. What do you think people in Northern Virginia, when they hear about this ministry, what do you think they think about McLean Bible Church? Wow, they're making a difference in our community. Even if they don't disagree, even if they don't agree with the theology, they say they're making a difference in the community. Today, this church has grown from about 800 to about 18,000. It's a pretty significant ministry in Northern Virginia. So core ideology is where we start with core alignment at the very top. Then we move into infrastructure. Infrastructure is, Jim Collins talks about first who, then what. And I want to emphasize that because too often, especially in the Presbyterian Church, we start with what we have and then how to put people into the roles that we have. That needs to change. We need to start moving into a mindset that says, let's leverage people's giftedness. as a church. Let's take where they are strong and put them into the right roles. And so this quote from Jim Collins, the executives who ignited the transformations from good to great did not first figure out where to drive the bus and then get people to take it there. What did they do then? They first got the right people on the bus and the wrong people off the bus, then they figured out where to drive it. All that is to say that when we work with the church, we've got a process based on StrengthsFinder that looks at the configuration of each person. We call it your intentional difference, and it looks something like this. 85% of what most people do, others are capable of doing. So 85% of what I do, traveling on an airplane, driving a rental car, showing up at a conference, somebody else could do. 10% of what I do, someone else can do. So I speak at conferences, I speak at churches, I consult, and I've got others that I'm training to do that. There are a number of people who do what I do at TAG. A number of people at your churches who can do what you do with some training, but only 5% of what you're capable of doing is unique to you, that really nobody else can do. And we talk about the 6 dimensions of your intentional difference. We examine this with every pastor that we're working with. We're looking for what are those consistent outcomes they've produced? What are their driving passions? What are their assimilated experiences, their knowledge, their skills? But the starting point is prevailing talents. So this is a concept I want to introduce to you quickly here. The idea of starting with how is a person naturally wired? How has God designed you to be unique, and how do we leverage that? So, you read that other slide. I won't take the time to read through it. Don Clifton. Anybody know that name, Don Clifton? Okay, Don Clifton, PhD psychologist. Back in the 60s and 70s, all of his colleagues in the world of pop psychology were asking what's wrong with people. And let's come up with classifications for what's wrong with people. Let's talk about personality disorders, OCD, narcissism, clinical depression, and so forth. He said, nobody's asking what makes successful people successful. So he was curious. So over the course of 50 years, he looked at the top 2% of most industries in the United States to look at what made the successful people successful. What he found out was a couple things. Number one, these people intuitively knew what their strengths were. Number two, they knew when to use their strengths. Number three, they knew when not to use their strengths. What he found is that it didn't matter what the strengths were. In fact, he identified 34 different strengths that were up there on the screen just a second ago. 34 different talent themes. And we look at the top 5 for any person. So we've then, with another company out of Texas, organized those 34 talent themes into 4 different categories. Connect talents, which are colored blue. Reflect talents, which are colored green. Energize, which are orange. Mobilize, which are purple. And we take those 34 talents and group them this way. And I'm going to show you some people in this room here in just a minute who've actually been through this. But the way that we analyze your particular configuration of talents is through this grid. Core Clarity is a company in Texas, and we're licensed to use their materials. But this is, in my mind, life-changing stuff. We had, in the FAA a couple of years ago, we had 2 guys on the same team. One of them, this was in the Next Gen project, which is about the modernization of the air traffic system in the United States. One guy was in the creative role, coming up with new ideas. Another guy was in the compliance role. The problem was they kept fighting. They didn't like each other. And they'd been on the same team for year after year after year in those same roles. What we realized is the guy in the creative role had as his talent, we'll go back to this slide, actually to this one, he had his number one talent was deliberative. He was the creative guy. What happens when you are a deliberative? What does that mean? It means you're cautious. You find 10 ways to say no before you can say yes. That's deliberative. The other guy who was in the compliance role had as his number one talent ideation. When you hear that word, what do you think of? Creative, yeah. So one guy would come up with an idea, the other guy would shoot it down, and neither one of them was playing to their strengths. So he said, guys, change roles, switch. They did, and that team has been humming. ever since. So understanding your team, yourself, and those around you is critical. We have some talents that are external. Those are the blue and the purple talents. Those are about other people. The blue is about how I interact with other people, and the purple is about how I mobilize other people. Then at the bottom, we have internal talents, which is how I interact with myself, the thinking talents, that's green, and how I motivate myself, which is orange. So part of alignment is not just the thinking behind core ideology, code, and strategy. It's saying, let's take a look at how people are wired, and let's get them in the right seat on the bus. So Dave Peterson, this is his profile. You notice he has one of each color, right? Two thinking talents, one connecting talent, one mobilizing talent, and one mobilization talent. He's got a harmony as his number one talent. Guess what I heard last weekend when I asked the 100 people at that session retreat which talent they were going to miss most from Dave Peterson? Harmony. He's done a great job of keeping the peace around here. And he's got achiever, learner, consistency, and competition. We won't go into the detail of each one of those. Let's take a look at another person here in this room, Jim Peterson. What do you notice about Jim? All green. What is green? Do you remember? Reflecting, thinking, yeah. So when Jim was pastor at First Pres Colorado Springs, and we were working with him a couple years ago, one of the questions he was asking was, is this the role that I should be in? And the people of the church loved him, and he was doing a great job there. But when the call from Gordon Conwell came to teach, ding, 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 that's a fit. He would rather spend his time thinking than doing just about anything else. Bob Coy, who's the pastor of Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale, 25,000 people in worship. This is his profile. What's the one color he doesn't have? Yeah. This is the profile we say is the optimizer, or the first responder profile. Bob is great in the moment. But you notice, my cousin Stefan Chividjian is one of the pastors down there. He says that Bob will never write a book. Bob will never get on the speaking circuit around the country because he's not energized by the thinking that's required to do that. He loves his people. He's a wonderful pastor. He loves to be in that setting. So it's interesting, you start looking at these different profiles, you realize there's not one right profile for leaders. What makes them effective is they know who they are and they know how to live into their strengths. And this is my dad's profile, 4 green and 1 orange. So we'll put Jim and Dad at dinner together tonight and let them sit in a room by themselves and think. So when we talk about core alignment, we've got the code, the strategy, we've got the who. We won't get into the how. I want to wrap up with one other thought here, which is about the third point of the star, or the third point of the compass. What do these companies have in common? Zappos, Nordstrom, Starbucks, Whole Foods, Costco, In-N-Out, Southwest, Google, and one of our clients, Balfour Beatty Construction. First of all, they're all listed on Fortune Magazine's 100 Best Places to Work. They are all about culture. Now, one of the things that we've done in the work that we do with corporations and our private sector work is really focus on building that concept of culture. And culture is about enjoying showing up. But we also look at culture when it comes to churches. In fact, a lot of my consulting work started switching from focusing on the strategic plan to really looking at the culture. So we just recently did a survey of a church using our Transforming Church Index, where a church is compared to our national database on a percentile basis. A 99th percentile means they're off the charts doing great. A first percentile means this church is in trouble. So look at the answers that we got from this particular church. This church has helped me be more effective in my everyday life. Second percentile. Our church has an effective follow-up program for those who have visited our church. Second percentile. When people decide to leave the church, they are cared for in the process. Second percentile. Now, those of you who aren't real good at math, kind of like me, what that means is that 98% of the churches are better than this church. This church has clearly differentiated itself from other churches in effective ways, second percentile. I'm excited about where our church is headed in the next few years, first percentile. We can read through the rest of those, all in the first percentile. You think this is a church that's exciting, where it's a fun place to be, where the members love showing up for work and for volunteer positions and for church on a Sunday morning? It's a pretty distressed, pretty depressed congregation. Now, how do you think they've tried to address this problem? Tactical, strategic, or transformational solutions? Tactical, yeah. Yeah, they've got a deep issue, and the issue for this church really is about culture. And so this is the third point of the compass: core ideology, infrastructure, and now culture. Peter Drucker once said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And I'm convinced that that's absolutely true. We can come up with the best plans in the world, but if we don't have a place where our employees, our staff members, our elders love being together, working together, then all those plans are for naught. If we don't have a place where the members love talking with each other and love being together, then all the planning is worthless. So culture is really built on the compelling code. So we start with code, and then we build the culture on that. Let me talk about the benefits quickly of culture, and then I need to wrap up and get my dad up here. But culture, when we have a healthy culture, we create focus. We provide motivation for our members, for our volunteers, for our staff. We provide a sense of connection, sense of cohesion, and a sense of real spirit. When I was working with Tom Hall's church in Pittsburgh last year, one of the things that we noticed very quickly was the staff culture needed to be addressed, and Tom's done a phenomenal job of really working through developing that staff culture rather than focusing on all the tactical things that we could do to try to improve ministries. All right, I'm not going to hit that slide because I don't have enough time, but I want to hit one last learning here. Some of you have used the language adaptive leadership. We use the term transformational instead. Adaptive comes out of Ron Heifetz at Harvard. He's one of our friends. We've partnered with him on many things. But transformational leadership or adaptive leadership is all about process. Todd Bolsinger later today is going to talk some more about this, but one of the things that we've noticed is there's a lot of pastors, especially in this movement, who are using this language, but don't really understand the skill and the technique behind it. Is about process. It's not content. It's about process. An example of that. When I was, and I'll close with this, when I was about 6 years old, my dad was traveling a lot. He was traveling all over the world. So I got to see him rarely, but one of those times I got to see him was the Christmas holidays. So before Christmas, when I was 6 years old, this would have been about 1971, I went to see Santa Claus. And I told Santa Claus that I wanted a tree house. And Santa Claus said, "Okay, I'll get you a tree house." So on Christmas Eve, I went to bed. Of course, I'm 6 years old, so there's this magical thinking that somehow in the middle of the night there's going to be a tree house in my backyard when there wasn't that day. But I went to bed Christmas Eve firmly believing that I would wake up the next day and find a tree house in the woods behind our house. Got up, went downstairs, went into my dad's study to see what Santa Claus had left under the tree. And then we always had to have this long breakfast on Christmas. My mom would make this egg and sausage kind of souffle, and then we would eat that and do the dishes before we could actually go unwrap the presents. And it just seemed to take forever. And of course, I'd been up since 3 a.m. because I was so excited about Santa Claus. So finally, what seemed to be 2 in the afternoon, we went into my dad's study to start opening presents. We opened up all the presents, and I kept expecting somehow there was a tree house somewhere to be found. And the last little present I opened was a little box. And inside that box was the first clue for a treasure hunt. And it took me to another place where I found another clue for the treasure hunt, then a third place, then a fourth place, and finally it said, "Where do we play basketball?" I thought, the backyard. There's a tree house in my backyard. So I went running outside. I looked all over the woods for a tree house and looked in the backyard. There's no tree house. And I turned to my dad. I said, "There's no tree house." And he had this little smirk on his face, and he said, "Look down." I looked down at a pile of wood on the driveway. And a hammer, and a saw, and some nails, and I started crying. I didn't want wood and a hammer and nails. I wanted a treehouse. And I sobbed. I was so disappointed that I didn't have a treehouse. Over the next 3 months, Dad, who traveled a lot, somehow found enough time to build that treehouse with me. In fact, on Christmas morning, he said, "We're going to build this together." So for the next 3 months, we sawed wood, and we put the 2x4s up on the trees, and we nailed the 1x4s to make the sides and so forth. And I made a little zip line that went from the top down to the bottom, and we put a trap door in it. And what was the most disappointing Christmas became the best Christmas because we built it together. That's what process is. We can't go through transformational adaptive leadership by thinking our way through it. It's got to be together, it's got to be collaborative, it's got to be side by side, because the real work of dealing with resistance, dealing with competing values, dealing with transformation comes as we work together. Margaret Wheatley once said at a conference we had her speak to in Arizona, she said, "We cannot know the future, but we can prepare for it by knowing each other." And so at the heart of alignment, and Todd will hit this a little bit later, but at the heart of alignment is we need to know each other. This has got to be something we're working on together. We started late. I'm a little bit out of time. What we're going to do is have a 2 or 3 minute stretch break right now. Do not leave the room. Stand up, turn in a circle, sit back down, and we're going to have my dad up here in just a couple seconds. Thank you.